we kind of know the new generation of customers just want to be able to answer their problem. AI is enabling. So the first companies that can really adopt that will have a huge advantage in actually getting customers to use it.
I'm Ed Marsh, host of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast, and I appreciate you joining me for this conversation. While many of the episodes are really pretty actionable, this one is going to ask you to imagine a bit. And that may be exciting on the one hand, or it may be scary, because the gentleman I'm chatting with today is an MIT engineer who has set out to use machine learning to help engineers, but as a byproduct, I think potentially eliminate a lot of industrial salespeople. So buckle up for this conversation. Dr. David Anderson is an expert at the intersection of machine learning, engineering design, and manufacturing. He has successfully developed and deployed machine learning systems for companies ranging in size from Fortune 50 to small, fast-moving startups, and across applications ranging from ideation to rocket engines, literally creating hundreds of millions of dollars in value. So he knows what he's talking about. He received his bachelor's in mechanical and ocean engineering from MIT, and then went on to work in robotics, which led him to his doctorate in human factors and engineering design automation. And along the way, really focused on studying the role of computers in engineering and manufacturing and how to increase their value. His postdoctoral studies have gone further into focusing on machine learning for inverse design, leveraging simulation to accelerate design processes. And he's currently the founder and CEO of Engora, the most effective and trustworthy AI assistant for design and manufacturing as they explain themselves to the market. So this is going to go deep, and we're going to get deep in a hurry. And there's certainly some folks in your company, whether from the board level through executive management down to marketing and sales, who need to hear this. So please do your part. Share it, comment, like it. Even if you don't necessarily like the message, like the episode and make sure people hear about it and subscribe. So with that, David, thank you so much for joining me and welcome.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
Good. Now, I talk with a lot of folks about the power of LinkedIn, and I should point out that I think I first learned about you and Engora through LinkedIn. I think a post from Ellen Ellsworth of the Mass MEP. So just kind of for what it's worth, I wanted to call that out and just quickly ask you what your how you use LinkedIn as you're in this kind of startup stage that you're in.
Yeah, so as an early stage startup, and then I'll say we're still early stage. Our tech's working, but I wouldn't call us, established yet. So as an early stage startup, one of the most difficult challenges is, I like the phrase channels, the term channels, right? How do you actually find the right people to talk to efficiently? And now one of the problems is you don't necessarily know the right people to talk to because you're still early. So You have this weird mix of both experimentation and then testing, right? Once you think you have an option. So LinkedIn's been really good as a platform where we're working in the industrial space, right? Not the best presence on, say, Facebook or TikTok. Now, that isn't to say there's actually some really interesting manufacturing TikTok and YouTube channels, but definitely the audience is less focused on that. So for us, LinkedIn has been the platform of choice for that broad industrial audience and that kind of decision maker profile, right? So when we produce content and put it on LinkedIn, we find much better engagement and much more relevant folks coming in front of it. I can talk a little bit more about some of our experimentation with different platforms and channels as well later. But
yeah, that could be interesting as we get to that later on. So Ellen's post kind of triggered me and got me digging. And then through that, speaking of channels, I came across what I might even call your manifesto that you published on Substack in January 24, where it kind of laid out the premise for the way you see Engora. And I'm going to try to distill it, and you correct me where I'm wrong. But essentially you said, look, great design incorporates huge amounts of tacit knowledge. And that standardization of design communication that's happened gradually as there were standards and drawings and all that kind of stuff was a big step in facilitating the design, but not all tacit knowledge is captured. Some of it's latent knowledge, which can be gradually codified and digitized, but it's hard to do because it's inherently it's certainly unstructured and often captured in people's minds. Many engineering tasks involve a person doing relatively simple things time after time, day after day, searching catalogs, checking compatibility, doing conversions, but it's all predicated on accumulated years of tacit and latent knowledge. And so those tasks take time, but they can't just be handed off because they need all that embedded knowledge to do it. And so you're working to try to solve for that. So in other words, create automation that will help backfill that tacit knowledge to help somebody quickly accomplish what are essentially administrative tasks. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's well summarized.
Okay. So clarify the distinction between tacit and latent knowledge in the way you use them and think about them.
So actually, sorry, I might say there's tacit and explicit. I might have misspoke there a little bit.
Okay, so tacit and latent then are essentially synonymous.
Yeah, and I know that can be a little bit controversial, but in this case, I'm kind of using them.
Everything is
In,
controversial these days.
yeah, in my mind, the question is the knowledge in a format that can be sort of communicated open loop,
Okay.
or do you need that sort of feedback and experimentation? Is it something you can actually communicate to someone else, or is it something they just have to learn by doing and experimenting? Have we figured out how to actually distill and communicate and replicate that knowledge effectively?
Okay. All right. So explicit knowledge is you measure force this way, and here's how you do the calculation, and then all you have to do is make sure your math is right, and you get the right answer. Whereas the tacit or latent knowledge might be, well, you need to understand that with certain situations, the dynamic force behaves differently, and you need to account for it in a different sort of way. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's much better examples than I can come up with out there from actual philosophers and stuff like that.
Right.
But
Right.
I think math is a really interesting one. So if you go back and read some of the early work in math, before we had developed a lot of this language around equations and algebra and all that sort of stuff, it was basically written as narrative paragraphs asking you to imagine the behaviors of objects. And so you needed a lot of sort of shared experience to actually understand what were they talking about, what are the assumptions there, all that sort of stuff. And then over time, we built better and better abstractions. So now we have this very clear, compact, repeatable way of sharing those knowledge through equations, numbers, programs, that sort of stuff.
Got it.
So it's one of those gradual things transition between those two based on other knowledge and systems we have in place.
And it strikes me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it strikes me that as knowledge builds on knowledge, that the explicit knowledge boundary moves and then the tacit knowledge boundary continues to expand beyond that. So what was tacit knowledge, as you described early on in mathematics, is now explicit, but there's a lot of other tacit knowledge that's developed since then.
Yeah, exactly. And I look a lot at software and programming. I did a lot of that in undergrad and then through grad school, where in the early days of programming, it was still all or an enormous amount of tacit knowledge. You need to understand circuitry. Codes might be poorly documented. You'd basically be flipping through cookbooks and then figuring out how do I adapt this for my needs.
Mm-hmm.
But then as sort of those programs themselves got more and more intelligent, more of that tacit knowledge got coded as explicit knowledge in the program, and we could use those programs for more and more, that boundary kept pushing to the point that now I don't need to understand anything about networking to make a website. But now that tacit knowledge is more around like, okay, how do I actually adjust the layout of the website? How do I
Right.
make it look nice? How do I make it fast? Right. So
Got it.
that boundary, you're exactly right. That boundary has shifted.
Got it. Okay. All right. So in that Substack article, you then went on to describe your vision for the outcome as, and I'm going to quote here, we want a future where the rote work of system architecture, component sizing, vendor selection, and sourcing are incrementally automated away. And that's kind of what jolted me back in my seat when I read it, because I think what you're saying very clearly with very sincere intent is that you want to make engineers more effective and efficient.
Hmm.
want to shorten project time. You want to eliminate busy work. You want to embed generations of tacit knowledge in their work. Now, what I hear is somebody that spends my days on the sales and marketing side, I hear, wait a minute, we're going to automate away vendor selection and sourcing. And so that many of the functions that marketing and sales teams believe they perform will likely be obviated in the process, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, this is evolution. This is the way industries change. Marketing used to spend time doing sandwich boards, and now they spend time doing TikTok videos, and then they'll spend time doing something else. What I want to do is get people through this conversation thinking about the fact that that's coming and understanding why it's coming.
Yeah.
Now, my guess is that you spent years before you began your startup. You spent years as a practicing engineer, and so I'm sure that through those years you had, experiences with salespeople, experiences with marketing collateral that shaped your kind of worldview. That there's not necessarily a lot of value added in those experiences. On the other hand, you may have had some great ones. Do you remember an engagement with a salesperson? May not have even had the title salesperson, might have been, application engineer or something like that. Do you remember one that ever helped you step back and think about doing something differently because of the value they brought?
Yes. So I'll say there's the positive and negative way of interpreting that question.
Okay.
So I'll say the negative side was at one point I was helping spec out some additive manufacturing equipment for an R&D shop we were putting together,
Okay.
and it was one of those cases where the only way to get any info about the machines was to fill out a form on the website, wait for their salesperson to get back to you, have a series of back and forth calls where none of these like three or four people we were talking to would give us just the numbers we needed to make a decision. It was always more negotiation. And I get
Right.
that, having sort of been on the other side, I understand why. Um, so I'd say that is like maybe the negative example of
Yeah,
that
that's
time
friction.
when, yeah, exactly. Now on the positive side, I'd say definitely. So it's a little bit. So one example was working in drones, working on some projects with drones,
Okay.
and I'll be honest, the electrification is moving incredibly fast. Electric motors have been moving incredibly fast. There's so much new technology out there that I am completely out of date from my years in undergrad. And so that was a case where actually being able to talk to someone at one of these, I guess the term would be motion industries, that I know that's also a company, wasn't that, but in
Right.
that industry, and actually talking through, here's our performance requirements, here's the trade-offs, what are the different options, almost as a starting point to then go do our own research. And I'll say they had a pretty good catalog. So once we had talked with them about what are the options, what are the trade-offs, understood that, we could go do a lot of the independent research in terms of, okay, what's the exact product number we need? But
Hmm.
having an expert in the field be able to talk us through that process of, their job is to stay abreast of the industry and understand what's going on. And luckily, they worked for a distributor with a huge selection, so they knew everything out there, and they could sort of guide us through that process a lot faster than had we been stumbling around ourselves.
But then I'm struck by the parallel to this explicit and tacit knowledge thing, because there's certainly people that the salespeople who can say, "Hey, look, describe to me the specs and your requirements, and I can help you cut through stuff, and I can help you find quickly something that matches that." But then there are a small number of salespeople who can say, "Absolutely, we can do that, and I don't want to waste your time, but help me understand what's the end goal. What are you hoping this motor is going to enable this drone to do, and what problem are you trying to solve with that drone, and what's going to differentiate between success of that project or failure?" And that context can often then help a great salesperson approach it in a slightly different angle, saying, "Okay, what I'm hearing you say is you've built your spec around the vertical lift requirement, but it sounds more like torque or maneuverability might be important. And if I'm understanding that correctly, then does it make sense for us to shift this specs conversation a little bit this way?" Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Um, it doesn't happen very often. I think that's part of the reason people get frustrated with industrial salespeople, though.
Yeah, I'd say one of the challenges is, as you said, finding the people who take that approach.
Right.
But then the other challenge there, and this is where it, the other challenge there is the speed and scalability, right? So a
Okay.
handful of these folks exist, but actually getting in touch with them is hard and slow. And that precludes a lot of interesting engineering projects, right? In a startup, in a company, manufacturing, time is money. And so the faster and the more scalable you can make that knowledge, the better, right? And there's a lot of different models for that, but that's kind of a lot of from the engineering perspective or from the operational perspective, that's a lot of our philosophy.
All right. And part of where I want to get to at the end of this is an important part of what you're doing is saying, let's from the demand side, let's embed that knowledge so that demand works more efficiently.
Mm.
But I'm also intrigued by how could we take the same concept and apply it on the supply side where salespeople are augmented with expertise that will help above average salespeople become superstars so that you can scale on the supply side of the talent as well as the technical information. So I want to circle back to that. And I don't know if you're prepared to talk about it from that perspective, but I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So that's kind of the baseline where we are, that engineers need information. That information needs to be built on explicit and tacit knowledge. Um, They need to move quickly. There's a lot of wasted time. If we can use automation to help them do it, that's great. Often they don't get the value out of sales and marketing information other than just access to information with friction. And so that's kind of what we're trying to solve for. Let's back up though. And I always am really interested in somebody's background because often that context helps to understand what has shaped their perspective that's leading them to offer the advice that they are. So, just kind of broad brush strokes. How did you end up at MIT, and what drove your original interest in engineering?
Yeah, so I've always liked tinkering with things, possibly to the annoyance of some of my family, just taking stuff apart and not knowing how to put it back together again always.
Like the vacuum
Um,
cleaner or something on the living room floor?
yeah, and so I think that's what drove me into engineering was just that interest and mechanical engineering specifically because I really liked playing with physical things more so than chemistry or software or any of that. Um, so that's what drove me into this. And the funny thing is, so MIT studied mechanical and ocean engineering because I grew up near the coast, loved boats, all that kind of stuff. Just
In
found the
New England or
underwater
elsewhere on the
in,
coast?
in New England.
Okay.
Just found the underwater world really fascinating. Um, but took a lot of software classes because that's still interesting and it was a very growing field at the time. So I always kept running into this friction around knowing what computers were capable of, and then just having to manually do a bunch of integrals in my in my engineering classes or something like that. So I kind of always had this friction in my mind about like why are we doing any of this? But the actual moment that made me really interested in this problem was after graduating. We were working at a company using a lot of serial elastic actuators. So the idea there is electric motors, really good force response, really stiff. The challenge there is that means they're not human safe, right? They can easily hit you, and they're really bad at, or sorry, they have really good position control, really bad force control. So
Okay.
they're not human safe, and they're pretty hard to control force. If you just put a spring in between your actuator and the end effector, you've turned your position control into force control by measuring the displacement and can tune the stiffness so you can
Hmm.
make it safer for your
Okay.
application. That's called a serial elastic actuator. Now the challenge there is this means you have your performance target for the sort of response curve, the performance of the actuator. You need to simultaneously pick a motor and a spring and a sensor to accomplish those targets.
Okay.
The problem is the way you do each of those steps currently is you basically come up with performance requirements for a motor and then go into catalogs and look for a motor that meets those requirements. And that's how the whole system is optimized.
Hmm.
But you don't know what those performance requirements for the motor are because those also depend on what springs are out there and also depend on what potentiometers are out there. So when you're in this world where you have to pick all three simultaneously, and it's you don't have established solutions already, You kind of
Right.
just have to guess and check for weeks at a time. Right? But this is a sort of problem of if you just had that data available, computers would trivialize this. You could just
Hmm.
power through billions of combinations and find the best one. And the system equations there are simple. So that was the original motivating problem. That was what drove me to grad school to be like, why is that not possible? Why is the industry such that that data isn't out there, isn't in a readily accessible form, any of that sort of stuff? Um,
And when you asked that question, did you get blank stares like, that's stupid, we just know it's not there? Or did people say, wow, great question, we never thought of it?
so it's funny. I actually got a different response for both of those, which is we totally agree. And we don't know why this hasn't been fixed yet either. I think so. There's two things there, and so that's the response from the engineer side. Now, I have heard the response from the sales side or distributor side explicitly. We don't want that, right? I think there is still a bit of that to be frank, old school thinking that you know we might not be the best, but if our customers don't know we're not the best, we can still exist,
As though
and
the
that's
customer doesn't get a vote.
exactly. I'm not saying most distributors are not like that. Most
Sure.
manufacturers are. Most of them are the best at whatever their chosen vertical is. But that definitely is a thread of thinking we've run into where it is risky for us to enable those comparisons because we have an established customer base, and right now our interest is retaining and growing that customer base, not exploring sort of radical new verticals or expanding into new areas.
Right.
So our focus is more about keeping these people involved in us than making our info accessible to other people.
Yeah, but I mean, the same mentality exists when people had to open the bank of green books on the wall, Thomas Register, probably before you got into business. Back when the salespeople controlled access to information, and
Mm,
even physical data sheets had to be delivered by a salesperson, and then the internet changed that. But many people, I guess, still are locked in that idea that somehow they can control the information, and that somehow protects their position.
yeah, agreed. And I think that is one of those things that is both. It might be true for a individual company, but it is really bad for the manufacturing ecosystem. So I went to grad school in Singapore, spent a lot of time in Shenzhen, and there is something incredible about being able to go to a 7-story electronics mall and just browse for parts where you have competing vendors right next to each other. And I can just, go actually see the physical things, try fitting them together, all that sort of stuff, right? That ability to rapidly discover and compare products
Hmm.
is a critical step to both innovating and responding to disruption, something we saw all through the
So an
pandemic.
old world physical analog to the knowledge base that you envision, essentially.
Exactly.
Why Singapore?
Oh, that's a good question. So, a couple of things. One, there was a professor I wanted to work with who had moved over there. My research interest was fairly niche at the
Hmm.
time, and the it was really interesting. So the government was actually investing heavily to create a new university to help drive the innovation ecosystem in Singapore. So it was
Right.
a really unique opportunity to be able to scope a lot of that program and work myself, really be on the forefront of driving that kind of innovation in that environment, which is, Singapore does have a surprisingly large industrial base. So it was a really interesting hybrid of both of those and work with a professor I wanted to work with.
Got it.
Plus, I lived abroad, but only for very brief periods of time. So it was kind of a fun chance to just live abroad.
And then you were there, what was it, 6 years?
5 years.
5 years? Then came back and founded, or maybe you founded Engora when you were still overseas. That was in 2018.
Yep.
Um, was thinking about the time between when you had that eureka moment and when you actually founded Engora, was that a short flash to bang time, or did you noodle that for a long time and think through iterations before you said, okay, I understand how we're going to try to do it?
Yeah. So I think it was actually, to be completely honest, I don't think there was an exact eureka moment.
Okay.
So the thing was, 2018, 6 years ago, LLMs didn't exist. I think
Right.
it was 2018 that GPT 1.5 first came out, and it was terrible, and no one cared. Um, So this was long before any of that technology, long before any of that tooling. So through grad school, we had found the inaccessibility of this data was one of the biggest barriers to automation in this space, but it seemed like way too big a problem to solve. Right.
Right.
So a lot of the original conception of Engora, and I'll say this was all happening part time in the background while I was working as a postdoc, so I also didn't apply all my time to it. But the
Right.
original ideas of Engora were much smaller in scope and more about just data sharing and all that sort of stuff. So I think one of the lessons there, more from a startup perspective, was go big from the beginning. There's a quote by the architect, I forget his name, the architect of the whole Washington Mall, among others. Make no small plans, for they have not the magic to stir the blood of man, I think is the
Mm-hmm.
quote. So that was, I think, a mistake. So we had an idea of this was a problem to solve, but it wasn't until several years later that we finally were decided, could we just prototype solving this problem? And saw some good results, but I'd say it's still an ongoing process.
All right. So this feels like a good time then for you to offer a more formal introduction to Engora. Tell us about the company and technology.
Yeah, so I think we talked a bit about this, but I describe Engora semi seriously as we're a team of engineers who got fed up reading through catalogs and data sheets and wanted
Okay.
to do something about it. Right? So that has gone through a lot of different prototypes and conceptions and versions over the years, and I can talk about those. But what that means right now is picture a chatbot like ChatGPT, but it was drawn from a data set of all the catalogs, handbooks, technical documents, data sheets out there, and could really understand how all that knowledge comes together. So when you ask a deep technical question, things about coding for applications of end mills and different purposes, or the trade offs behind different types of adhesives in a certain application, it can give you a sort of well reasoned answer with all of those citations, so you can go fact check it and build that trust, and then dive deeper. And so we've been seeing interest in a couple of places. One is on that strategic sourcing and just product discovery side, right? So I don't know who out there carries a product, and I might not know the exact terminology for it,
Mm-hmm.
but that's where these modern AI tools are really good at handling that ambiguity. And so they can help you sort of shortcut that process to finding the right terms, finding the right suppliers. The other application is similar, but it's actually more about workforce development, right? So the problem is learning that tacit knowledge takes decades, years
Right.
or decades of
Right.
experience. Um, so
And
we
good
can
mentorship and expensive mistakes and everything else along the way.
yeah. So often we know there's a problem we're trying to solve, and we can articulate that problem, but we can't articulate it in the right way to just find an out of the box solution or know where to look for that solution. And so that's the gap we're trying to fill right there. When you know there's a problem you're trying to solve and you can articulate that problem and describe that problem, but don't already know the sort of usual solutions to that problem, how do you fill that knowledge gap? And that's where we can come in.
So who do you see as the ideal user? Is it a junior engineer that's lacking tacit knowledge that has problems on their plate to solve, or is it somebody different?
Yeah, I think so. And this is where, as a still relatively early stage startup, we're still exploring a lot of that. But
Mm-hmm.
definitely those early stage engineers, or another possibility is engineers working a bit outside of their comfort zone, right? This
Okay.
comes up a lot in the startup world or smaller shops where a new job comes in and you might not know everything you need to know to solve that, to accomplish that job.
Mm-hmm.
So that is definitely the category where I think we would like to have the biggest impact, right? If we could really just enable people to make things more effectively and faster, I think that's one of those visions that nobody's opposed to that,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I think that the recent experience watching SpaceX land that booster back on the tower has really gotten people to kind of rethink from a first principle sort of perspective what's possible, and it feels like you're doing something, different entirely, but nevertheless trying to get people to think differently about eliminating some of this cumbersome iteration and wasted time and just make stuff that works faster and better.
Yeah, I think it's some of that question of how much of the process and speed is intrinsic is just necessary to accomplish the engineering versus intrinsic, right?
Right.
Necessary because of secondary factors, the structure of our organization, the built-in assumptions we have about this process.
And so what stage are you at? Should folks bookmark
Oh,
chat.engora.ai and go to it routinely as part of their workflow, or is this more of a novelty at this point?
oh yeah, no. So it is working. I'll say, yeah, go to chat.engora.tech, check it out. Please give me
Dot
feedback.
tech. Got
I
it.
would say, oh yeah, no, I would say the where we're at right now is it's early, so the tech is working, but now we're applying it to different domains and figuring out what's our starting point where we can really demonstrate value. So there's a couple of things there. One is a just public facing tool,
Mm-hmm.
and in that case, we really would appreciate feedback on what data should we add, what industry should we focus on, what verticals should we look at. Right now, we're kind of just generic industrial suppliers around New England, but that means that's such a huge space. We
Sure.
definitely don't have complete coverage. And then the other side is we've been working a lot building internal tools for these companies. So if you're a small manufacturer, but do a lot of maintenance and repair work, so you have access to extensive handbooks for helping repair machinery. We can make that faster for you to navigate and understand how to fix stuff. Or if you do a lot of prototyping or sourcing, we can help you automate all of that. That's a little bit higher touch, but that's something we also would like to explore. But definitely start by going and playing with it. People are already using it and enjoying it right now, so it has some utility already.
So I'm interested in that example you provided of, let's say you've got a lot of maintenance requirement, and does third shift have the same knowledge, or does the recent hire that's only been there 2 years understand the art and the science and the character of each of the machines, and how to make them work and how to quickly get them back online? It There's a step that I'm missing between extracting that from somebody's mind and having that available in the LLM. How do you do that? Is that with extensive interviews, or what do you do?
Yeah, so right now we're not handling that. So the cases we're dealing with are more manufacturers working in the MRO space. So they already have manuals from a big supplier, like think Textron or
Okay.
UTC or UTC, telling them how to repair things, how to do all that. Right? That's where we can operate right now. Now I'll say separately, there are companies doing exactly what you just said, and I do find that part really exciting.
Yeah,
There's
that
also
feels like that's where you cross from the explicit information or knowledge that's in the manual to the tacit knowledge that's in somebody's head.
yeah. So I'd say there's sort of two things going on here. One is how do we take tacit knowledge and make it explicit?
Okay.
And honestly, that is less what we're dealing with right now. And there's other companies dealing with that. The other challenge is given a lot of explicit knowledge out there that assumes tacit knowledge to interpret and apply. How do you work with all of that? And that's the part we're kind of focused on, right? So knowing what I think it's for bearing shaft collars, what American companies call radial misalignment, German companies call parallel alignment, or something
Okay.
like that, right? That's the kind of stuff that's where we're operating right now.
Got it. All right. So a question that's going to seem so incredibly naive to somebody with your expertise, but for a layperson like me, just let's quickly level set the difference between machine learning, LLMs, and Gen AI.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think that's. I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that we're still struggling to answer a little bit. So machine learning is about having a computer make decisions based on prior examples given to it, right? So the idea is rather than explicitly telling a computer of writing a program saying if this number is greater than if this number is greater than some critical value, do one thing, otherwise do another. We could just hand it a pile of past examples of
Right.
behavior and say, hey, what do we do? Right? That's machine learning. That's all it is. That's why people will sometimes describe it as fancy form fitting. Doing a linear regression in Excel is machine learning, right?
Okay.
um, Generative AI is so there's a lot of different ways people talk about that. One way people talk about it is when your output format is the same as your input format, right? So you can think of I could train a machine learning model to take a bunch of pictures and spit out what's the likelihood of a defect in this picture.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could train it to on a bunch of pictures and say, make an example picture with a defect, and it spits out an image that didn't exist originally. So that's sort of the classic definition of generative AI, is that latter one. When you're
Okay.
producing more examples, but drawn from the same domain as the
Okay.
input,
All right.
sort of filling in that domain. That's not how people quite use it anymore. So what we're seeing now is, because, in a lot of cases, you could feed an image into one of these chatbots and say, is there a defect in there? And it would write out the text saying, yes, there's a defect, or no, there isn't a defect. You could argue that's sort of the same because they trained it on a mix of image and text inputs. Um, but that's sort of yeah. So it's a little bit of a fuzzy term around there, where it's sort of the question of, are you generating new content that looks like the input content, or are you just answering a different question given some input content.
And then LLM is just the body of knowledge behind the AI engine. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, so an LLM is a specific architecture
Okay.
for a certain class of generative AIs. So the idea there's a large language model. So there's a class of language models, which are just generative models that specialize in natural language. And then there's the idea of a large language model, which is a generative model with a ridiculous number of parameters. So for AI, one of the questions is, how many parameters does your model learn, right? So in linear regression, you're learning two, a slope and a y-intercept. ChatGPT has, it's estimated, I think, about 1 trillion different parameters it's learning.
Wow.
So that's on the large side. So then under that, there's a lot of different architectures. There's GPT is a architecture for LLMs. So LLM is sort of a class of architectures and models
Okay.
that use a lot of parameters to do generative learning of natural language.
Got it. I think I've got it. You used the term fuzzy a minute ago, and I know you recently gave a talk that explored what you call the conflict between the inherent fuzziness of LLMs and Gen AI compared to the formality of engineering and manufacturing. And I think I understand what you mean, but not quite. So give us all an answer. What you see there and why that's worth thinking about.
Yeah. So I think the interesting thing here is our goal in manufacturing or engineering is concrete. It's explicit. It's G code for a machine. It is an actual physical part. It is a 3D model with as much annotation as possible for how each surface should look and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, the goal is to represent the final artifact as concretely and explicitly as possible.
Acknowledging that the map is not the terrain. There's a
Yeah,
difference between them.
totally. And that's where some of the latent knowledge comes in. Where do you fill in those gaps and all that sort of stuff. Now, the on the AI side, so talking about LLMs and sort of modern generative AI, what it's really good at is handling that ambiguity of natural language, right? Fundamentally, all LLMs are doing basically is predicting the next word, given
Right.
a bunch of words you feed in. Given that, it's remarkable they're so good at instruction following, all that kind of stuff. But it also means they're not explicitly following any sort of logic or reasoning. They can struggle to provide formal outputs and consistent outputs. Right? So there's this conflict where the goals of Gen AI and LLMs are kind of orthogonal to the goals of manufacturing and engineering. So the question is, where do those uses actually overlap? Right?
Okay.
Where can we get value out of these tools? Because a lot of people will say, can we just have GPT spit out a CAD model, or can we have GPT just spit out that G code or whatever? And the answer is like, yes, but you probably shouldn't for a lot of reasons. So figuring out those places where the answer is yes and you probably should is kind of the big one. And that's where I think, as you said, some of it is that those places where there's a lot of latent knowledge right
Mm-hmm.
now, a lot of tacit knowledge.
So I'm thinking, if you've got 15,000 industrial suppliers, and they each do a good job of creating information and sharing that information, not behind paywalls, not behind the friction of a form and talking to a sales rep and a discovery call that you don't want, all that kind of crap. But that information is out there. You can do a Google search or an
Mhm.
internet search, and assuming that the crawling and the search indexing is effective, you'll get something that matches your search. Like you may get a link to a data sheet, but it's absent any of the context. And so, in other words, it may not be the right one. It may not to account for factors that you forgot to mention in your search, or that in a search query you couldn't articulate the way you can in a prompt for a chatbot or something like that. So, I mean, I guess if I were to reframe what you're trying to solve, it's helping people find the information that's contextually appropriate, not just that meets a certain search query.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is one of the reasons I find LLMs and generative AI really interesting. So there's actually been a lot of past research efforts to develop a complete ontology for industrial components, right? How would we completely describe every possible cutting tool? So we could just have an SQL database, some schema, and just populate it for everything. Those have basically all failed.
Why?
Because the actual properties you care about can vary so much based on the problem you're trying to solve. Completely capturing that knowledge seems, is incredibly difficult. An example is people using bearings as slip rings, right? You shouldn't do it. You can in a pinch. It's a problem. It's a hole. But like the formal ontology isn't going to capture the info you need to do that.
But I think another example of that, though, is how often do you hear from a vendor who says, "We never thought of that," when they encounter some engineer that's come up with a creative and completely different use for a technology or a part or a component than was originally intended. So, yeah, it may have the technical attributes that the vendor or manufacturer had in a certain context as they designed it that way, but now it's applied in an entirely different kind of a way.
Yeah, exactly. So that's that. Yeah.
So how would you develop an ontology for that anticipates the serendipity? I mean, you can't. So I guess that's why they failed, right?
Yeah, and that's where I think this ability of LLMs to handle that kind of fuzziness and sort of impute that relationship becomes really powerful, right? I think that's the big breakthrough that is enabling this kind of transformation now.
All right. So are you sitting there kind of chin in your hand 22 hours a day coding this? Or, I mean, do you have a life outside of it? Do you have time for recreation and enjoying New England where you grew up? What's your
Oh
life
yeah,
like now?
yeah. No, it's well, I just moved to a much bigger space, so better, I'll say, in terms of
Okay.
how my life is. No, I have some free time out of it. I part of it is I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and I still love working on hardware,
Hmm.
but just don't get to do as much now with the software startup. So a lot of my free time goes to various engineering adjacent things. I was just on the note of using products out of their intended application. I was just at a home built submarine convention on Block
Wow.
Island, which was super fun. Got to go down in one of the submarines. But that's an example where Min Colta trolling motors are really popular on these submarines. Definitely not intended to be used 400 feet underwater, so people have to hack on a whole bunch of oil compensation systems and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, they're doing it. So yeah,
So your hobbies are adjacent to your work, or let you scratch the itch that originally got you into engineering. Music, fitness, history, anything
oh
else?
yeah, yeah. No, I guess all of those. So history, been reading a lot about medieval Europe recently. I just find it pretty interesting. Fitness, I do jujitsu and a lot of biking, and then I've also been baking a lot recently. So
Interesting.
just learned how to braid to make braided breads. So that's been exciting.
Is that from that English baking show that triggered that, or you
Oh,
just
Great British Baking Show. No, it was actually while I was in Singapore and couldn't find a cheap Western bakery. So I just had to start making bread myself. And then it's kind of just spiraled out of control with family holidays and me always being the baker for those. So
and you've got your own proprietary sourdough starter that now you carry around the world with
I
you, or
do
what?
I do have a lot of notes on attempts to make a good pizza dough for the oven. That's been my that's my white whale. the
Got
windmill
it.
I'm tilting at. Yeah.
Experience tells me that folks like you that have the creative drive and the technical chops to run a startup or launch a startup have tried a lot of things. So, what's something that you really leaned into along the way that turned out to be a mistake or a disappointment?
Uh, in my life or on the startup side?
Well, and I mean, it could be personal life or from a business perspective.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll say from a business perspective, I guess we did go through a lot of different prototypes, right, to get here. And so a lot of those we would iterate, launch, and then not get much of a response, which we do a lot of the customer discovery and all of that ahead of time to try to mitigate that, but you
Hmm.
still end up just having to do it. Um, so some of the examples there would be early on, we were doing a lot of stuff closer to that formal ontology. So this was before a lot of the chatbot stuff. We're taking all of these catalogs, websites, and sort of get them in a consistent format. So not a formal ontology, but be able to essentially translate between two catalogs so you could compare them. And I'd say that's one of those things that got a lot of interest, a lot of excitement. Nobody used it when we launched it. Or they'd use it and then be like, it's like needs this other feature and everything. So
Right.
that was definitely one of those like, that was probably a waste of effort. No, I mean, we learned a lot. We didn't know it was a waste up front, but in retrospect, it was a bit of a waste of effort.
I'm reading a
And
book right now, and I'm going to screw the title up, but something like "Fall in Love with the Problem, Not the Solution."
hmm,
Have you read that one?
no, but I like the title.
Yeah,
I'll
it kind of
say.
talks about that product market fit problem, and that if you're solving for the problem, your likelihood and lead time to find that product market fit is a lot shorter than, oh, this sounds really cool. Let's build this because we think
Hmm,
it's going to be fun.
yeah.
For companies that spend a lot of time trying to be unique in how they market and sell, I mean, this has significant implications for them. I mean, I'm thinking about potentially the natural extension, and you said that this is inadvisable for a lot of reasons, but the natural extension would ultimately be for somebody to just ask the LLM for what they need and let the LLM design it and 3D print it, as opposed to even helping them find a manufacturer. Or is that a potential outcome?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing there, and this is also part of the motivation for a lot of my work, right? Digital fabrication, super cool. 3D printing, super cool. Still hasn't really had that big an impact, being honest. Like it's had a surprisingly big impact, but still not a huge impact. We're still
Mm-hmm.
mostly manufacturing things the way we did before. I honestly think part of that is that issue with knowledge sharing and the speed of development in engineering. Because 3D printers and 3D printed products have totally different design principles than our usual products.
Mm-hmm.
I actually worked on this in grad school. There's a paper I'm on trying to develop design principles for 3D printed objects. Um, and so, as a consequence, you almost need to rethink how every product is made with a 3D printer. The problem is there's a lot of products in any engineered good, right? So like going through and rethinking like, oh, ball bearings from 3D printers are terrible, right? How do we enable rotary motion? Do we even need to enable rotary motion? Can we use some sort of weird flexural element? All that. All of that is basically a massive white clean sheet engineering effort at every stage in your product. And so I think that is a future I'm really excited about and want to see. But I think the limiting factor right now is that those digital fabrication technologies can't quite match our existing mass manufactured products. And so we really need to figure out how do we rethink the engineering of our entire system
And
around these manufacturing capabilities.
will the LLMs reach the point where they can do that rethinking and then even design the manufacturing tooling that's necessary to create these new designs?
Yeah. So if you force me to give an answer, it's that AI and machine learning, yes. LLMs, no. Right?
Okay.
LLMs as a subset of that space, no. But that's where there's really exciting stuff happening around tool use and all of that, where the LLM is just one part of a larger problem solving system. And that I think gets us closer to that. So I think LLMs will probably play a role in there, but I don't think it will be an LLM doing that task. It'll be a much more complex system.
And is that problem solving system going to be with a single brand on it, or is it going to be an aggregation of tools from different developers?
That's a good question. To be honest, I would like it to be an aggregation of tools, right? There's a part of me that gets nervous whenever there's true centralization of access to information,
Mm-hmm.
right? Controlling that information by one party makes me a little bit nervous.
Sure.
So I would like to see it be more of an aggregation of tools. I think in the short term, that's how it will go because I think the manufacturing and engineering space training an LLM, building an LLM from scratch is an incredibly expensive process. So that's beyond the capability of most companies. Meanwhile, the manufacturing space takes a lot of deep knowledge and tweaking and doesn't, a lot of people don't realize how big it is. So I think in the early days, we won't see much overlap between those two, right? You'll have a bunch of companies building general purpose AIs, and then you'll have companies focusing on applying them to these, you know, I don't want to
Right.
say niche because it's like the second largest industry in the United States, but
Right.
niche
I understand.
applications. Um, so I think that's how it will be going in the early days. Now that's where who knows, maybe OpenAI or Anthropic will actually create an AGI and then they can just build this system internally or something like that. So
Got it.
long term, I don't know. I could see this all being sort of owned by a single company, or you do have large software players in the manufacturing and engineering space. Your Autodesks, PTCs, Dassaults of the world. So
Mm-hmm.
there's certainly players of a size and capability who could build that system. Um, yeah,
So some of the things I commonly hear about Gen AI that are concerns for companies is the security of proprietary and confidential information that they feed into it, and the risk of hallucinations. Now, if from an Engora perspective, you're providing citations for everything, then I guess the hallucinations is not an issue. But what about this information security issue? If you're doing a creative design that's going to leapfrog you ahead of competitors, the very prompts that you're asking and the performance capabilities you're looking for could reveal what you're doing. So how do you protect that?
yeah. So I would say there's sort of three. It's a three-part answer.
Okay.
So one is you can approach it as we do every relationship in the business world, which is just contractual agreements, right? Like Anthropic, I think Anthropic claims they're HIPAA compliant, all that sort of stuff. They will set up custom agreements, same with some of Microsoft's products and all of that. They will set up an agreement where they will keep your data secure and won't train on it and everything. And if you really don't trust that company, it's hard to function in the business world because you don't really trust any company. So that's one part of the answer, the least satisfying one. The second one is that, especially when it comes to mitigating hallucinations, there's a lot of different technologies you can use to do that. And some of those technologies let you keep your data more secure. So maybe it's not the final output, which is secure, but a lot of the input data, like a lot of your internal documents and historic documents, you aren't just feeding those in
Right.
and naively training on that. You're doing something more clever to keep some of that data secure. Then the third thing, which I am excited about, is I know of companies. So some of these open source large language models are getting really good. And one of the cool things is because they're open source, they're really fertile ground for innovation. So
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes they'll actually be a little bit ahead, maybe not as performant, but ahead in terms of some technology than the closed source models. Um, I do know some companies which are starting to run their own open source LLMs internally, so like Llama 3.2, so they can keep it all on prem, all behind their firewall, all that sort of stuff. That's a really interesting future, especially as more work goes into making it cheaper and faster to run these large models. I think that's a really interesting direction for some of these larger companies to explore.
Got
Um,
it.
yeah.
All right. I'm going to ask you a question, and they're not an easy answer. There may not be an answer. And if you can't answer, just say that. But I'm wondering, for somebody with your expertise, what would a sales rep have to do if they came in and sat down with a meeting with you to earn your respect and create enough value for you that you actually were willing to carve out time on their calendar and say, you know what, I'm going to get value from meeting with this person?
Yeah, I mean, putting on my engineering hat. So back
Right.
when I was doing actual hardware instead of whatever it is I'm doing now. I think I think what I'd want to see is a depth of understanding of sort of the engineering of what they're selling, right? So what are from my perspective as an engineer, what are the trade-offs? What are the options? What am sort of I thinking through as I consider these options? And do you understand that as well, right? Can I sort of trust outsourcing some of that thinking to you? Because I don't necessarily have the time or want to go do that research myself, but I need to trust that you'll have that understanding and do that research well.
But that's a fascinating way that you just put it. That a valuable salesperson will be one to whom you're comfortable outsourcing some of your thinking.
Yeah.
Nothing about product information, nothing about pricing. It's about understanding the problem you're trying to solve in the context of your problem and helping you identify with their tacit knowledge to complement your tacit knowledge, help you identify the explicit knowledge or product that applies properly.
Yeah, and be able to explain a lot of that, right?
Right,
Like why is this the best product
right.
for our problem?
And then a slightly different flavor of that. What would a salesperson have to do to add value as a resource working in parallel, for instance, with Engora?
Yeah, I mean, I think the real thing there is just making information accessible, right? And there's a blurry line between marketing and sales and all
Right.
of that. So I think starting to move a little bit more from sales to marketing under this world where search tools, whether it's Engora or someone else, search tools are getting more intelligent. It's going to be more competitive, and there is a generational shift where younger people. I don't know. I feel like I'm old, but I'll say I'm younger. Like younger people aren't used to and don't want to have to call up a phone number, have a 20-minute discussion, like go through all that rigmarole. They just want to be able to quickly figure out, is this possible? What's out there? And then launch into a deeper discussion. They want to
Mhm.
sort of do that qualification themselves instantly online.
Yeah,
Um,
statistically, buyers are 70% of the way through their buying journey before they want to talk to a sales rep.
oh, wow, I didn't know that statistic. That's
Yeah.
a good one. I'm definitely going to borrow that. Yeah, so I think moving in that direction of how do you actually produce. I'm not a huge fan of the term thought leadership, but it's almost that, right? For your industry, for where your products excel and your knowledge, can you articulate that more clearly so that I can, in a way, I can discover faster?
But it feels like in parallel, you have to create more of that thought leadership or content or
Mm,
whatever we want to call it that provides the context. So not just here's the data sheet, because any monkey can spit out data sheets and put them on the web so you can crawl them and index that information. But again, if we go back to this challenge of tacit knowledge, then if that content can provide contextual framing for why different things work in different situations and those trade-offs that you're talking about, that it feels to me like that could potentially be helpful. Is that right?
yeah, yeah, and I think that's where it's like some of the best distributors at this, the way they frame everything is they'll sort of tell you the trade-offs amongst different categories as you're navigating through it. So it's like you're looking at, different types of piping. What are the trade-offs? Why should you choose one category over another? So being able to understand the trade-offs that would motivate someone to go in one direction for a product versus another, that's kind of the key. As you said, it's not just the data sheet. It's not just here's a pile of numbers, figure it out. It's why would I choose stainless steel over aluminum for this piping or something?
All right, so we're going to dive into that in a second. But first, before I forget, where did the name Angora come from?
Oh yeah, so it's a combination of engineering and agora. So the plaza in ancient Athens, or I guess a lot of Greek city states, which would serve as simultaneously a public market for actual sale and transfer of goods and a point of debate around
Got it.
ideas. So the idea of combining those with
Make
engineering. Yeah.
Makes sense. All right, so to that point that you just made about thought leadership or content or whatever we want to call it, how does marketing need to shift their thinking about the kind of content they're creating and how they make it available so that as these LLMs learn, they're actually incorporating that information to the benefit of the marketer and the vendor.
Yeah, I think one thing we'll see maybe is a shift back towards more comprehensiveness, right? So I think there's been a shift in a lot of marketing and a little bit less so in the industrial space, but a lot of the pressure for the past several years or decade has been more minimalism, right? How do I phrase this in 7 words? How do I get this
Three
down to
bullet
the
points. So
punchiest?
you can distill complex problems into 3 bullet points.
Exactly. And a lot of that was driven by things like SEO, where it's like you're going to have 10 words on the search engine, or you're going to have an ad on the side. You have like 10 words to get someone's attention. How do you do that? Still a critical skill, right? I still think that'll be a really important skill. But at the same time, you have this problem of when it comes to generative AI, it's more how much information out there is there for it to learn from and learn those connections, right? So if you only talk about your website, this is a problem for us because our website's basically 5 words right now because
Right.
it's mostly a landing page. But if you only have like 3 bullet points or a very high level summary on your website and then just a form saying fill this out to learn more or something, um, like people asking complex queries, the gap, the amount of inference that AI needs to do to link their problem to your solution or site is much greater than someone who actually somewhere has detailed descriptions of what they can do, how it works, how it solves problems, all that sort of stuff. So that will put you on a back foot. And it's not an insolvable one. Again, as these AIs get smarter, they're better at that inference, all of that. But I think being able to provide those kinds of deeper insights and more comprehensive descriptions, if you're assuming there's an AI in between you and the customer, that will give you a leg up there, I
And is there
think.
an early mover advantage with AI like there was with SEO? Like some companies just really understood instinctively they needed to optimize around certain key terms, and that put them so far ahead that other companies are still trying to catch up 15 years later. If you do that with AI, will that help create a moat, or if somebody does it well tomorrow, then suddenly does the AI catch up with that?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes, but it's a lot fuzzier. I feel like that's been the key word for this conversation. So there's two things there. One, when it comes to you yourself adopting AI, that is the current trend in how people work with products. And you can say it might just be hype, it might go out of the way, but still, if you are the best distributor or manufacturer for people to actually make what they want because they can just work with an AI, people are sticky in manufacturing. So that has an advantage. Now, on the flip side of AIs you don't control learning what you do and then trying to drive people there, I think there is still a first mover advantage. And we can see this, it might be even stronger than some of the cases of traditional SEO
Hmm.
because of the cost of relearning and retraining all that data, right? Like even the biggest companies, OpenAI, which is investing literally billions of dollars a year in this, can only afford to retrain every couple of months or something like that. So there's people working on shortening that gap. Arguably, we're in that category, but even more so than with traditional search engines, there can be significant lag in actually updating the index, updating how things sort of respond. So yeah.
Okay. So what's the role of a company's website going forward? Should they have 2 pages for everything? One page for the person that needs headlines and bullet points in order to skim it, and another page to teach the AI in excruciating detail?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think part of that is we're still figuring this out because there's also people pushing and saying like the role of a website is to just be a chatbot and have all that data in the back and behind it. I don't entirely agree with that, ironically, but I think the answer is somewhere in between where it's you need that content in there, but again, like we're relying a lot on the AI to perform that inference and connection. So it's not necessarily the case in classic SEO style. You need like a bunch of keywords hidden in the HTML or hidden in the
Right.
footer of the page, right? It's more that somewhere you need to clearly articulate what those trade offs are. You can't just assume there'll be searchers who are looking for a specific class of lock nuts and know exactly why that matters and all that kind of stuff.
And what
You
if
can still
you
have that page, but yeah.
what if you explicate those trade-offs through a series of videos that you host on YouTube with
Yeah.
interconnections. So Google clearly understands that your website connects to your YouTube channel. Is that a way to do it, or does everything have to be on your website?
No, I think that's definitely a way to do it. The way I think about a lot of this stuff in my head is how do you make sure the amount of inference the AI needs to do is relatively small. So if it doesn't really matter where the content is, if it's in YouTube, but you're talking about your products and talking about why to use them and how, that gap's pretty small for
Got
the
it.
AI, right? Again, like managing videos is a bit tougher for AIs, but there's a lot of work there, so that's improving fast. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Um, yeah, so I think that sort of stuff is still great.
So should companies be thinking about reaching out to somebody like your company or people like you with your technical understanding to approach this from the other side? Should they be creating digital sales assistants to support their team and put on their website to go beyond just a chatbot?
Yeah, I think yes. I'm obviously a bit biased there, but yes, I think part of this is there's a classic quote. I forget who says it, but we tend to overestimate the short term impact and underestimate the long term impact of
Right.
new technology. So I don't think, and I mean, there's a chance I'll be eating my words here. I don't think we're going to see like the internet replaced with chatbots or all of sales replaced with chatbots in the next year or two. Um, so I think the bigger question is, so one of the things is the leaner you can make your team to solve a problem, right? Not your organization, but just the team involved in solving a problem. That makes you exponentially faster. And speed and cost is everything. So the more you can figure out places to adapt this tooling internally to sort of improve the performance of your organization, that's what gives you an actual exponential advantage over your competitor. And that's really the only thing you can control, because that outside world, it's going to be happening no matter what and hitting you and your competitor, and you can do some stuff to try to optimize for it, but it's mostly out of
Or you
control.
could be like those distributors that just hold their breath and stomp their feet and say they don't want to share the information.
Yeah, exactly. um, yeah.
So we talked a minute ago about if you're trying to use a tool to source the answer and how your prompts might reveal some of the thinking behind it, which could potentially be a confidentiality or proprietary trade secret issue. How about for the company that's trying to push those dots close together for AI that wants to talk about what they do and ways to use it creatively, but they don't want to reveal proprietary information? What's the best approach there?
That's tricky. I mean, one thing is to talk about it, I think, in terms of those comparisons. So even if you're not, here's our data sheet, here's our exact capabilities. So again, this comes up with some of that min colta stuff, right? Where they don't want to give out too many of their general engineering parameters because they're really just building a trolling motor. You
Mm-hmm.
just care about some high level parameters. And they don't want to make it easy for other people to replicate. So they tend to keep those numbers secret. But you can still talk about what the relative advantages of Min Colta are over competitors, right? Are you quieter? Are you more efficient? Do you have a broader operating speed range than other people? All that sort of stuff. Um, so I think still framing a lot of it, because these AIs are, they can reason, massive air quotes, about it, but they're still pretty bad at it. They're much better at just sort of translating information, right? So if you've already done the work of saying, here's why this product's better than any other product out there, they'll do a good job translating that into different ways people might be expressing their problem. But if you just give a list of facts, they're not going to do a good job translating that into a solution.
Got it.
So this is a case where I think those two actually align. You don't need to give away all those secrets or how you do it. You just need to articulate why somebody would want to use you.
Got it. Okay. Um, you talked about how this is coming and companies could pretend that it's not, but um, I think if a company is thinking about how to use a bit of AI in their own operations but hasn't really considered how it changes their market, how how far out do you think we are from a reckoning or a come to Jesus moment? Is this 18 months away or 10 years away?
I definitely put it more on like the 10-year side. I think a big part of the thing here is it's more a factor in that larger generational shift. of how people purchase, how people look for parts,
Okay.
where manufacturing is happening, right? Because let's be real, AliExpress is not bad. I mean, it's bad, right? There's a lot of asterisks after that, but a lot of people can still turn to it and use it, and it's just getting better, right? So I think the reckoning here is not AI is just going to be one of those tools reducing the friction for people to find the products they need, right? And so if you are behind the boat there, it doesn't mean the brakes are going on immediately, but that friction's definitely gone up. And
Got it.
so over time, that will drive out more and more, yeah, customers.
So we're recording this about a week before the U.S. presidential election, and this is not a political question or conversation other than to just ask, would your answer about the timeline and the potential outcome depend on the outcome of the election? Do you think that one outcome is likely to accelerate this and another to retard it, or do you think that this has enough inertia that it's running on its own?
I think it has enough inertia. It's running on its own. I mean, I won't say there won't be an impact. There will definitely be an impact, but I mean, at a high level, nobody has. If you frame these as benefits or problems, right? Either way, nobody has a solution.
Right.
So there'll be a lot of people trying to solve it and trying to frame it either way, and that could definitely have an impact. But it's also one of those things where the system is adaptive, right? Even if people try to stop it, if there's value there, other people will be trying to keep it going. And it's so I'm always a little bit yeah. I think the genie is out of the bottle, and while it might impact the speed or the timeline, I don't think anyone's going to be able to put it back in.
And thinking about this question of tacit knowledge, there's a certain amount of tacit knowledge that goes into defining the problem correctly and writing the right prompt. But there's always this question of, we can call it unknown unknowns, or we can say Mark Twain said it's not what you know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. What if the person writing the prompt doesn't fully understand, doesn't have as much tacit knowledge as they think they do? Um, can the AI solution ever push back or ask additional questions to if it feels like it's a fringe case where some of what's being asked for needs to be challenged?
Yeah, so from a technical standpoint, yes. I think this is one of those cases where there's a lot of active research happening to say what is the right way to do that, right? Because again, existing LLMs are just predicting the next word. So in the prompt, you can give them options like ask follow-up questions if there's a lack of clarity, etc. But that doesn't actually guarantee it'll work well,
Right.
right? So I think it is technically feasible. It is an active area of research, and I think we will get there because you can think of it almost analogous to our older style expert systems where remember when you'd go in and answer a bunch of questions to sort of go through a tree,
Mm-hmm.
right? That technology hasn't gone away. It's as popular right now, but it's still out there. So there's all these interesting research angles combining these different techniques and technologies to mitigate some of those challenges. So yeah, I think it's possible. I don't think we've solved it yet, but it's definitely possible.
Is there a book that you often gift to people? Like if somebody approaches you as an investor who needs a deeper understanding of the space to be comfortable to understand your solution, is there a book that you gift to people that you think is a great explanation of
Oh,
where we stand?
that's a good one. My honest answer is no. What I would say, and I honestly can't remember if I mentioned this in that talk I referenced earlier, but it's not a book. But outside of Boston, in Chestnut Hill, there's the Metropolitan Waterworks Museum.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I suggest people go take a look. So the idea there was, Boston needed more water after the Great Fire. So they built this beautiful Gilded Age pumping house, but they actually still have a bunch of the old pumps there. And so you can basically see in 40 years the development of engineering, right? And I think that captures a lot of how we ended up where we are and sort of where we want to go. So I'd say check that out.
And aside from actually going to the museum, and in your talk, you had a great picture that showed there was a different wrench for every different nut
Oh
because
yeah.
there was no standards. But aside from going there physically, if there isn't a great book, are there podcasts or YouTube channels that you recommend people follow?
Oh, this is a tough one. I think there are some. I'm struggling to. I'm struggling to remember them. I apologize. Or I can definitely try to think of them after.
Yeah, if you think of them,
Um,
shoot me an email. I'll drop them in the show notes.
yeah, will do.
And
Um,
if people want to get in touch with you, if they think, certainly they can go to chat.angora.tech and try it. But if they think, geez, we want to talk to David because we believe maybe we need to plug into this in a more substantive way, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
oh yeah, email always works. DSA, my initials, at engora.tech.
And
So
if they just go to not
there
the
you go.
chat site, but the direct site, angora.tech, I think that's right up there on the
Yeah,
homepage, right?
yeah, I think so.
And and what are you looking for now? Are you looking for specific beta users or investors or technology partners? What's your main focus?
Yeah, right now our main focus is design partners. So people who sort of take a look at the chatbot and think there's some way that they would use it regularly, whether it's on internal data or a particular subset of external data, but have that idea of like, this is how we would be using this on a daily basis. If anyone gets struck by that, we would definitely want to talk to you.
Okay. All right. Regardless of the profile of the company, could be large, small, in different
Oh yeah,
industries.
right now we're talking to all of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we're coming to the end, and I'd ask you to wrap us up. This has been a fascinating conversation from the vendor perspective, from the buyer perspective, from the engineering perspective, with tech wrapped in and all kinds of stuff. But based on your LLM and machine learning and AI knowledge, how will industrial marketing and sales change over the next 5 to 10 years? What will no longer matter? And what should people begin to prepare to start doing?
Yeah, I mean the way I think about it is we kind of know the new generation of customers just want to be able to answer their problem instantly, right? They don't want to have to talk to people. AI is enabling that, right? So the first companies that can really adopt that will have a huge advantage in actually getting customers to use them, right? We all know those massive distributors that have enormous markups, but just because they're so
Right.
right. So I think that is the pressure we will be seeing. Those companies that can leverage AI to increase their ease of use and ease of discovery for the customer will be winning the next generation of users, right? How big that is, how fast that is, what exactly that looks like is all up in the air, but I think that's the trend.
So it's not about the technology. The technology is just an enabler. This comes back fundamentally to buyer expectations of buying behaviors.
Exactly.
Well, all right, everyone listening. First of all, thank you, David. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. This is great.
Don't bury your head in the sand. I mean, this could fundamentally change the way that you market and sell, or it should. I mean, it's your decision whether you want it to or not. But if you want to satisfy buyers, I think David's laid out a very clear roadmap for how it's going to evolve. It's going to change how your buyers buy. So share this episode with your colleagues in marketing and sales and management and ownership to help them understand, just begin to introduce some of this future state, to then begin to understand, do a gap analysis and figure out where you are and how you need to change mindset before you even worry about behaviors. And of course, like, comment, share, and subscribe as well. Thanks for spending time with David and me, and for watching and listening to the Industrial Growth Institute podcast.